Imagine standing on the edge of greatness, the world at your feet, empires kneeling, and kings trembling at the sound of your name. That was Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812. He was not just a general, he was the embodiment of ambition, discipline, and brilliance. From the blood-soaked fields of Europe to the golden halls of Paris, he had reshaped the continent in his image. But in the summer of 1812, one decision would change everything. A decision born not of strategy, but of pride. Napoleon's invasion of Russia would become one of the greatest military disasters in human history. An army of more than 600,000 men would march into the heart of a frozen empire, and only a fraction would return. By the start of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood unchallenged as the ruler of continental Europe. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. Nations that had once defied him, Austria, Prussia, Spain, now existed under his shadow or his control. But power is never secure. Across the eastern horizon, one man still stood beyond Napoleon's grasp. Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Once, they had been allies. After their meeting at Tilsit in 1807, they had pledged mutual friendship and respect. For a moment, the two greatest rulers of their time had stood side by side. But time eroded that friendship. Napoleon demanded that Alexander enforce his economic blockade, the continental system, against Britain. The Tsar refused. Trade with Britain was the lifeblood of the Russian economy, and Alexander would not sacrifice his nation for Napoleon's pride. To the Emperor of France, defiance was unforgivable. He began to plan not just a show of force, but a campaign of punishment, a march to humble the Russian Empire itself. Diplomacy failed. Spies and diplomats carried warnings across Europe. The greatest army ever assembled was preparing to move east. By spring, the scale of Napoleon's preparations stunned the world. He gathered the Grande Armée, over 600,000 soldiers from every corner of his dominion. French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, even Spanish troops, all bound together by loyalty, ambition, and fear. The roads of Europe trembled beneath their march. It was more than an army, it was a civilization on the move. 500,000 men, 200,000 horses, and miles of wagons stretching as far as the eye could see. Napoleon believed that this immense force would end the war quickly. He had beaten every opponent before: Austria at Austerlitz, Prussia at Jena, the Russians at Friedland. He was convinced that one decisive victory would bring the Tsar to his knees. But there were cracks beneath the surface. The army's supply system was strained beyond its limits. Communication lines stretched thin across vast distances. Many of his soldiers were young, inexperienced, or unwilling conscripts from conquered lands. Still, Napoleon believed in his destiny. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the river Niemen into Russian territory. As the first columns waded through the current, Napoleon stood watching and said quietly, "Now begins the war that will decide the fate of the world." He expected glory. What awaited him was devastation. The French advance began swiftly, but the Russians refused to fight. Instead of meeting Napoleon in battle, they retreated, leaving only ashes behind. The Russians had learned from history, never fight the invader on your doorstep. As they withdrew deeper into their own territory, they burned everything that could be of use: crops, livestock, barns, entire villages. They would feed their enemy nothing but hunger. Napoleon called it a barbarian tactic, but it was working. The deeper his army marched into Russia, the emptier the land became. The French soldiers began to suffer. Food grew scarce, water was polluted, and the summer heat turned disease into an unseen killer. Men collapsed along the road, horses fell dead from exhaustion, and wagons sank into the mud. Still, Napoleon pressed on, convinced that one great victory would end the campaign. The Russians, meanwhile, waited, buying time, watching as nature itself became their ally. By August, the Grande Armée reached Smolensk, where the Russians finally stood to fight. The battle raged for hours, the city burned, the streets ran with blood. And when it was over, the Russians withdrew once again, leaving nothing but charred ruins. Smolensk was a victory without reward. Napoleon had gained ashes and lost another 100,000 men. the French continued eastward toward Moscow. By early September, they finally caught up with the Russian army. The Tsar's new commander, General Mikhail Kutuzov, decided to make a stand at a small village called Borodino. Here Napoleon would get the battle he wanted, a clash to decide the fate of Europe. On the morning of September 7th, 1812, under a cold gray sky, cannon fire shattered the silence. The Battle of Borodino had begun. The fighting was savage. French and Russian soldiers charged, countercharged, and died in waves. Cannonballs tore through ranks. Musket fire filled the air with smoke and screams. Entire units were wiped out in moments. Napoleon called it the most terrible of all my battles. When the smoke cleared, the French held the field. The Russians withdrew once more, battered but unbroken. Napoleon had lost over 30,000 men. The Russians lost as many or more, and yet the Tsar still refused to negotiate. Napoleon had won the ground, but not the war. His army was exhausted, his supplies nearly gone, and the Russian heartland still stretched endlessly ahead. A week later, the Grande Armée entered Moscow. Napoleon expected triumph, surrender, perhaps even a treaty, but instead he found an empty city. The streets were silent. Shops, homes, and churches stood deserted. The Russian population had fled before his arrival. And then the fires began. Within days, flames consumed the city. Wooden houses ignited, and the wind turned the fire into a storm. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as Moscow burned around him. It was the largest city in Russia, and now it was ashes. He waited for Tsar Alexander to beg for peace, but no envoy came, no messenger, no surrender. Napoleon had captured Moscow, but he had lost his purpose. For over a month he waited in the ruins of the city, hoping for a letter that would never arrive. As autumn deepened, a new enemy approached, the Russian winter. Food ran out, fuel was scarce, horses died in the cold. The French army, once so proud, began to starve and freeze. Finally, Napoleon gave the order: retreat. The retreat from Moscow began in October. The first snow fell within days. The temperature dropped below freezing. The soldiers wrapped rags around their feet because their boots had disintegrated. Every night, thousands died of exposure. The frozen roads were littered with corpses. Men fought each other for scraps of food. Horses were eaten for survival. Discipline collapsed. As they retreated westward, the Russians attacked from every direction. Cossack cavalry struck the columns, cutting down stragglers and looting the dead. At the Berezina River, Napoleon's army faced its final horror. Trapped by Russian forces on both sides, they tried to cross the freezing river on makeshift bridges. The scene was chaos, cannon fire, panic, and drowning men. Tens of thousands perished in the icy water. When the remnants of the Grande Armée finally stumbled across the border, fewer than 100,000 men remained, from 600,000 to less than 100. The greatest army Europe had ever seen had been destroyed, not by an enemy's genius, but by nature, exhaustion, and pride. Napoleon's dream of empire was over. His enemies saw their chance. Across Europe, nations rose against him. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia united once more. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. In 1814, the Allies invaded France. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and sent into exile on the island of Elba. He would return briefly in 1815 for one last desperate campaign, the 100 Days, ending in his final defeat at Waterloo. But the glory of his empire was gone forever. The invasion of Russia had broken not just his army, but his legend. It was the moment the unstoppable force met the immovable land and lost. Historians have long debated why Napoleon made the fatal decision to invade Russia. Some say it was strategy to punish betrayal. Others say it was pride, the belief that no power could defy him. Whatever the reason, the lesson remains eternal. Even the greatest leaders can fall when ambition blinds reason. Napoleon once said, "From the sublime to the ridiculous, there is but one step." In 1812, he took that step and fell into the snow. The invasion of Russia stands as a warning carved into history that no empire, no ambition, and no man is greater than nature itself. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered Europe, was undone by his own greatness. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more deep dives into the turning points of world history, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Tell us in the comments, which Napoleon campaign should we cover next? The rise of the emperor or his final defeat at Waterloo?